fishing, it's in my soul.
Welcome to the Salt Strong Podcast, disrupting fishing entertainment as you know it. Prepare to laugh. Prepare to get to know fishing legends in a whole new and unfiltered way. And on occasion, you might even learn a thing or two about fishing. Here's your host, Joe Simons. Like diamonds.
Hello, Salt Strong Nation. Joe Simons, like diamonds. We are back again talking about Tampa Bay. we had on, it was quite the little panel, I guess, 2 weeks ago, Tampa Bay Waterkeepers, and great conversation. I learned a lot. We had really just a great discussion about what's going on, some of the main issues. And I received a lovely email from my guest here, Lindsay Cross, and I'm going to read it because this is probably the best way to introduce you, minus the wedding DJ part, of course, that I will bring up, of course. So, hi, Joe and Luke. I listen to your podcast, and I'm glad that you just featured Tampa Bay Waterkeeper discussing the red tide. I would love for you to continue to highlight this critical issue and wanted to offer myself as a guest. This is where it gets really good. I have 20 years experience working in the Tampa Bay area as an environmental scientist and conservation advocate. I worked for 14 years for the Tampa Bay Estuary Program and was the executive director for the Florida Wildlife Corridor, and now work as a water and conservation policy advocate and lobbyist for an environmental nonprofit, Florida Conservation Voters. I am also a candidate for the Florida State House, District 68 in Pinellas. That's St. Pete and Pinellas Park. And I'm running on a strong environmental platform and have been engaged in the rallies and various events with Tampa Bay and the Suncoast Waterkeepers, Captains for Clean Water, our friends there, Surf Riders, Sierra Club, etc. And then personally, you're a scuba dive master.
Yes.
A former triathlete and a competitive outrigger canoe paddler. Are you kidding me? Come on. What don't you do? And then I went and checked your profile and it said you were an ex-wedding DJ. And I was like, all right, I gotta get her on.
That's right. I think being a wedding DJ is probably the highlight of my professional life, but we'll just roll from there. So thanks for having me on, Joe.
Yeah, I'm pumped you're here. This is a conversation I think that will probably continue. And I think a couple years ago, we had a pretty bad red tide and we all got fired up about it. And then it kind of went away. And it was almost like we kind of swept underneath the rug. And I believe we're learning that that's just not possible, that this is going to continue to go on as long as we have sewage and discharges and all kinds of stuff. And one of the conversations you and I had offline is because I haven't been able to find this answer, is the history of Tampa Bay. I was born in the late 70s in Tampa, and my parents lived in Tampa, went to USF. And my dad had always told me when he was there in the 70s, he was into fishing and loved the water. And he's like, it was a cesspool. He's like, you didn't, not only did you not go fishing in Tampa Bay, like you weren't even swimming in the water. He says it was like legit sewage, just disgusting. And so I've always been intrigued because that sounds like kind of like rock bottom to me is, all right, how did they get there? And then how do they get out of it, right? I mean, that had to take a lot of people coming together, and it had to take all kinds of different parties and affiliations and municipalities and government. I mean, there's a lot to make that happen. And then we go downhill again, and here we are, kind of ticked off at, a lot of different issues, and everyone's kind of pointing fingers at this and that. And so I wanted to have you on to start the conversation there about the history of Tampa Bay. And I know you're younger than me and born in the 80s. So I know you don't, have a lot of experience, but I know you know a whole lot more than I do about the history just because of your background. So I'd love for you to kind of start there, and then we'll lead up to where we are today.
Sure, that sounds good. So first of all, I was not born in the 80s. I did love growing up in the 80s, but I was born in the late 70s, so not that young.
We're the same age. We're the same age. I'm just kidding.
We're the same age. Yeah. Only a couple counties away. But yeah, Tampa Bay has a really interesting history. Decades ago, our population, was around 500,000 people. There were not the strong water quality protections that we had in place. And so what your dad has told you about what he was experiencing is right on. There was essentially raw sewage that was being dumped into Tampa Bay. And that's the way we dealt with a lot of our waste, whether it was industrial waste or human waste. We just put it in the water and we hoped that it, floated far away and we didn't have to deal with it. And the old adage of dilution is the solution to pollution. Well, that works if you have a small population and a huge water body, but you get more people and you start changing what the landscape looks like, and that no longer becomes a viable or healthy thing to do. So Tampa Bay was basically a dumping ground for human and industrial waste. And there were floating mats of algae, like this sticky, gooey, stinky green algae that was blanketing Tampa Bay, especially in the upper portions near the city of Tampa, where we had our largest population centers. And so Bayshore, now we go up to Bayshore and people are, walking kids in strollers, they're rollerblading. We have the Gasparilla, the run, and the boat parade there. It was not a place that people wanted to be. And the noxious odors from the sewage and from the algae, they were so bad that people's silver was tarnishing inside their homes. So these beautiful waterfront homes along Bayshore, you wouldn't even want to open up your door and step outside. It was so bad. And what happened is people in the local community were fed up with it. They knew that it wasn't healthy for them. It wasn't a place you did not want to be in Tampa Bay. You certainly weren't swimming or fishing in there. And so they started making noise and demanding change.
And then you're talking about just the locals now at this point.
So locals, people within the Tampa Bay area. So Tampa Bay region, we consider Hillsborough, Pinellas, Manatee counties primarily. It's fed by a watershed that also includes a little bit of Pasco County. So people primarily in Hillsborough, Manatee, Pinellas County knew that something needed to change. And the way we have the most impactful things is really community-based grassroots things, where people started to get together and talk about, how can we make our water better? And they were able to appeal to some legislators that were serving up in Tallahassee. And in the early 1970s, there was a pretty groundbreaking piece of legislation called the Wilson-Grizzle Act, and then later one in the late 80s that mandated that the wastewater treatment plants considerably upgrade their plants to something that's called advanced wastewater treatment. And so raw sewage has a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus in it. We kind of use the term nutrients, but it feeds algae, it feeds plant growth. And so having too much of that in the water was causing this explosion of algae. And so our wastewater treatment plants are meant to take out, the solid materials and also those nutrients so that we're putting cleaner water back into our rivers, our lakes, our estuaries, and our coastal oceans. Yeah. So the Wilson-Grizzle Act required wastewater treatment plants to invest in significant upgrades. The city of Tampa opened a plant called the Howard F. Curran plant, which cost about $90 million at that time. So that's a significant investment that the local communities had to bear. But it started with a piece of legislation that said, we're not going to make these changes unless we have something really transformative. And so it started with that big water quality bill up from Tallahassee. And with that, it takes a couple of years for big changes like that to happen. You got to put the money into building a new plant. And then over time, you start to see the quality of the water improve. And then the ecosystem starts to respond in a positive way as well.
I know you weren't there at the time. Yeah, either was I. But do you think the headlines back then in the paper were all about red tide, or was it just sewage? Like, was that conversation still happening? What do you think?
I think the headlines were more focused on sewage back then.
Okay.
Red tide is something that we've had within the Gulf Coast for centuries. And I think that's where we get into an issue where something like red tide is naturally occurring. Algae is naturally occurring. But when you're thinking about it, you have to look at the severity and the size of it. So if you have a little bit of red tide and it's offshore and it's not affecting a lot of the wildlife or human health, it's not a significant concern. But when you start to get massive blooms that are, square miles and there's millions of cells per liter, then you're starting to kill off fish and wildlife and birds. Humans are seeing the impact. That's when it becomes problematic. So, it's just like things that we ingest in our body. If you eat a little bit of fat, it's okay. If you eat, meals and meals of fat, then your body is going to start to react in, kind of funky, not so good ways.
I wish you would have told me that earlier. No wonder I've gained so much weight. Should have had you on an earlier podcast. All right. So I think the question that I'm still not struggling with, but just I think we all want to hear is, how did that happen? Like, how did you get, let's just say, the state to invest at the time? And that's a lot of money. It's a lot of money today, but back then that's a ton of money.
Yeah.
So right now we're all ticked off. We have people raising money. We have a ton of great groups that you mentioned them in your email that are supporting this cause. We even have politicians, and you're going down that route. So I'd love to hear your feedback here they're all nodding and saying, yeah, we want to make change. But I don't feel like we're seeing that, right? And even,
Mm-hmm.
that Tampa Bay Waterkeepers was, they have that whole lawsuit posted on their site. And DeSantis is listed. I know because, he represents the state. They're not personally suing him. But like how on the history side of things, how do we get a group collectively together to truly like make some changes where like things are happening? And there's not a silver bullet. There's not going to be a pill that we just drop in the water and it's going to fix it. But I feel like we're just spinning our wheels right now. Like no one's seen any massive or really any real change yet. What are your thoughts?
So with the Tampa Bay recovery, it's, it started with the legislation, it started with investments. And so that usually means that your water rates, for residents in the area, you're going to be paying higher prices. There's a role for the state and federal governments to play in those type of things to make sure that, we're protecting the health of our community and of our ecosystem and our economy. And so we're in a similar position right now. With the kind of the jump start of the recovery in Tampa Bay, it didn't just stop with that. After those, regulations for the wastewater treatment plants, there was a group of governments and industry and agriculture that collectively got together and formed what was called the Tampa Bay Nitrogen Management Consortium, which is still operating today. And they recognized that it was in all of their interest to have a clean and healthy Tampa Bay, and that no one party could do it themselves. And so they formed this consortium to start to collectively reduce the amount of pollution that they were putting into the bay and doing it in a way that made sense for them within their business. So, for example, if a city upgraded its wastewater treatment plant, they're going to get credit for putting less pollution into the bay. If one of our fertilizer manufacturing companies starts to manufacture in a cleaner way, they're going to get credit. If agriculture goes to something called micro irrigation, where there's less runoff of fertilizer going into the water, there's ways to quantify the reductions you're getting. And so we started keeping this ledger of improvements. But what's really important is that they were backing that up with water quality data and specifically what was happening with our seagrasses and correlating to the fish and wildlife in the bay. So we know that underwater plants like seagrasses need light. So if you have cloudy water with lots of algae, you can't get light down to the seagrass. That dies, and then you're losing the fish, the crabs, the shrimp, all of those things that are, what makes a productive ecosystem and what starts to feed those fish like, redfish and tarpon and spotted sea trout that we all enjoy catching. Sarasota Bay did an analysis recently because they've lost about 2,000 acres of seagrass, and they did a study looking at fish and shrimp and crabs in seagrass versus bare sand, and found there's a difference per 1,000 acres of about 15 million fish and shrimp and crabs. So if you want better fishing, you need to have the habitat to support that. So you need seagrass and mangroves. And so the Nitrogen Management Consortium was able to correlate the reductions in pollution going into the bay with clearer and cleaner water. And as a result of that, more seagrass. We started to see more fish come back. We saw more bird species come back. You know, we have this vibrant economy where 20% of our jobs in the Tampa Bay region are dependent not just on having the bay there, but having a clean and a healthy bay. But it took decades, and investments in Tampa Bay were about $2.5 billion to make that happen. In Sarasota Bay, they've seen declines of seagrass, and their local governments are putting significant money into cleaning up their wastewater treatment plants. They're going to be spending about $1 billion on a couple of their wastewater treatment plants because they know that's what it takes to clean up the water and make sure that it's a place that, you know, businesses and tourists and residents still want to live and enjoy that quality of life.
So you mentioned the weight gain earlier. I mean, it almost reminds me of, you know, because losing a lot of weight takes time too, changing your body, changing your environment. It's almost like the person who loses all this weight, they get kind of, you know, where they should be. And then all of a sudden, like all rules go out the door and we just gain it all back in a short. That's what it feels like in general. So like what happened? I mean, could you say this Tampa Bay, Nitrogen Consortium? Is that okay? So they're still around. Like, where did we go wrong? Because now it's not so much human or is it? I mean, what are the major issues? Because I think on the last podcast, we all wanted to just have a smoking gun and we're going to say it's Piney Point or whatever it is. Like, what is it? What is causing all these issues in your opinion?
Yeah. So the main sources of pollution have shifted from, you know, these end of pipe sewage, you know, raw sewage, really to something that's called non-point pollution. It's stormwater runoff. It's runoff from our yards. It's air pollution. So emissions from our cars and from power plants. Air pollution actually turns into water pollution and is about a quarter of the nitrogen in Tampa Bay right now. But what we're also seeing is that a lot of the infrastructure that we built back in the 50s or 60s or 70s, like it's starting to break down. You know, sewer lines break. We have new technology. And so just like you can't buy a house and never repair it, I would like to think that you could. And that's why I'm maybe not the best homeowner, but you know, you have to make those continual improvements and adjustments. It's like the maintenance. If you're going on a diet and you're really aggressive right at the beginning, you still have to go running. You still need to go to the gym to maintain that good health. And so we can't rest on our laurels and never make those investments. And I think that's what we're seeing right now. When we have spills from wastewater treatment plants, it can be devastating. But what is really important about the Piney Point spill that happened back in April is that it is a source of pollution that is way more available for algae and this red tide in particular than the pollution that we normally have. So there was about 200 tons of nitrogen that came into Tampa Bay over a 10-day period from Piney Point. And that doesn't mean a lot to us, 200 tons, but it's the equivalent of what that part of Tampa Bay, the lower part of Tampa Bay, receives in an entire year. So it would be like eating all of your meals for an entire year, a little over 1,000 meals in 10 days. So it was a huge slug of, you know, food for this red tide algae. And it was also in a form that was essentially liquid nitrogen, which makes it really easy for the algae to take up. So it would be like injecting, you know, sugar into your veins as opposed to eating something that's harder to break down, like, you know, peanuts or brown rice. So it's in the form that algae just craves and can use really quickly. And that's why we saw that this red tide episode got to this huge bloom stage and started to get into places of Tampa Bay where we don't normally see it, and starts to have this massive impact, killing, we're up to more than 1,600 tons of fish and marine life and associated debris that Pinellas County has removed just in the past couple months.
And then you combine that with our issues of just normal pollution, right? And I after the podcast with the Tampa Bay Waterkeepers, they challenged all the listeners to just go to Google and search for sewage spills or sewage cleanups or sewage leaks, Tampa, St. Pete, Pinellas, Hillsborough. And it's crazy. It's like, holy smokes. There's pages of them, and many just kind of do get swept underneath the rug. They might make, a quick little, local news station, like they might bring it up. For the most part, a lot of them were just kind of like, oh yeah, another, because like to your point, another 100 gallons of sewage spills, and no one really knows, is that a lot? I mean, Tampa Bay's pretty big, maybe it can handle it.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have all these people too, man. So I know you don't have a specific answer, maybe you do, but as a politician, how do you juggle all that and actually make an impact and make change? Because I know that's what you're about, and that's it's very important. You've been here a really long time, and you're not someone who just says, "Hey, I'm going to decide to talk about conservation." You've been living it and breathing it for quite some time. So, like, what do you do? What's the solution? How can we all help?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of things that we need to do collectively, individual actions, but also accountability for corporate, for bigger polluters, as well as our elected officials. So, this is the type of thing that no one party is going to do on their own, but we can all do together. So the Piney Point spill really was a disaster waiting to happen. We didn't have some of the accountability in place. And we have phosphogypsum stacks around the state that also have this really nutrient-rich water that's got some radioactive properties to it. So we need to make sure that our Department of Environmental Protection is monitoring those places, and that specifically with Piney Point, that there's a full and appropriate closure plan for this plant, because there's still about 600 million gallons of water there that we need to dispose of. And we can't just dig a big hole in the ground. We can't just barge it offshore. We need to clean that water first and do the responsible thing for our environment. And that's going to take some money. The state's already put $100 million into the closure plan. And remember, this was owned by a private entity. And so we see these instances where corporations can't pay for the cleanup. They've already made money on their operations, and then they file bankruptcy, and ordinary people like you and I get stuck with the bill through our tax money. And it's really not fair. But we also can't ignore it. So the state will have to continue to work with the federal government, maybe some of the local governments, to have a closure plan that treats the water, because again, that water is still very nutrient rich, and we can't just dump it out into Tampa Bay or into the Gulf. So we need to have accountability there. We also need to be working cooperatively on upgrading the infrastructure that we have. So when you get a notice from your city or county that says, we're going to have to increase your water and your sewer rates, that's part of having clean water. And our economy is dependent on having clean and healthy water bodies and places to go fishing and enjoy with our families. So, it does sting a little bit when we have to pay a higher price, but we need to do that to continue to have a beautiful state to live in. The state also needs to pitch in and be a good partner to the cities and counties, and not just, find them when there's problems, but also be willing to come to the table with investments as well. So those are some of the things on a bigger bigger scale, our elected officials need to know that people in the community are watching what they're doing. So calling your local representative or your senator, or even, your city or county officials and saying, clean water is important to me, and I want you to make the investments. I think that we need to have stronger policies that hold polluters accountable, and we all need to be invested in this. So that's something that we can do today. And looking forward for elections, that needs to be part of every candidate's platform is clean water, because the legislation that started our recovery off in Tampa Bay was sponsored by Republicans. We know people on both sides of the aisle support clean water, but when you have so much influence from special interest, it's harder to get those things accomplished. Yeah. But you also have to win re-election every 2 years or 4 years. So if you don't think that your elected representatives are doing enough to protect your water and our economy, then you need to vote for someone who is going to do that.
Yeah.
On the individual side, there's little things that we can do. The amount of fertilizer that we put on our water is one thing. If you're using reclaimed water, that's already got some nitrogen in there, so you probably don't need to supplement it. And especially if you live on the water, if you live on a canal and you're fertilizing before a rainstorm, you're just feeding algae. You're not feeding your lawn. You're just sending that right out into the water and, creating dirtier water and reducing, the clarity and potentially the amount of seagrass that we have. The type of cars that we drive, some of our other activities, those all contribute as well.
And I've noticed, and you probably have too, in St. Pete, there's some just absolute gorgeous homes. And some of these have hurricane shutters like half the year because it's the second home for these people. And you'll see, the men and women spraying, and they don't live there. They're obviously working for a company spraying, and they're right near seawalls. And you're just like shaking your head. And there's been tons of videos that have gone viral from that. And the one, it was this was actually on the other coast, not Tampa, but when they had that really bad fish kill over in Indian River area, and the guy is a captain filming all these dead fish in the canal, and he's watching this person spray pesticides on the grass, on the seawall, and like you can see little driplets, like why he's spraying going right in the water where these dead fish are. And we're like, come on, people. And I know that's not the only problem, but to your point, it all adds to it. And as much as we'd love to go back to the days where there's, only a couple 100,000 people, it's not happening. People are not going to leave Tampa unless we just completely destroy the water. So we have to live with that part, correct? I mean, we're probably 5 years from now, it's more likely we're going to have more people, not less, in and around Tampa Bay. So that's just something we all have to kind of deal with. What else? Like, because I know the last group we had on talked about that as well as contact your representative. So if let's just say that's you, who actually reads those things? Is it an assistant, an intern? What actually happens? I think is a question I've always been like, all right, is it really worth it? Because I've done it before, and I usually get an autoresponder. Where does this go? What happens?
Yeah. So each of the elected officials has staff that are working for them, staff and interns, and they're listening to voicemails, they're reading emails. If there's just a couple here and there that are a one-off, then maybe they're not paying a lot of attention. But if they start getting hundreds and thousands, they notice, we don't have to get to thousands, but we should be flooding their inboxes with things. And we do see change. I think the example of Captains for Clean Water, that's a group that was fishing captains, people who make their living on the water. Yeah. And they got really invested in what was happening. They started going to public meetings, looking at what was happening with discharges from Lake Okeechobee. You see them at public meetings that are standing alongside elected officials and people at our state agencies, but they had a huge backing behind them. And people were calling their elected officials. And even if you don't know the nuances of the policy, like had never heard of advanced wastewater treatment, you can say, I want cleaner water. I want stronger policies and investments in our infrastructure. And then, there's people like me who work on water policy, and then we can figure out what that means and make up recommendations. So we do need people that are calling. We need people to attend rallies, like the rally against red tide that we had a couple weeks ago in St. Pete. People want to be part of something. They want to share in things as a community and know that their voice is being heard. Yeah. And they also want action steps. Yeah. So you start to get people to events. And then from there, they're able to share those things with their friends and neighbors. Maybe they're making calls. Maybe they're organizing their own get-togethers and sharing their thoughts and their recommendations on social media. And elected officials and other community leaders, they notice those things because, at the end of the day, we're all here, or we're all interested in serving the people and this great state. And if that's not why you're doing it, then you really need to be finding a different job.
Love it. So as an environmental scientist, I mean, the good news is that there has been a massive cleanup, and it seems like communities, regardless of where you stand and who you vote for, people have come together, which has been really neat. It's cool to see a unity on something versus all the division that we've all been experiencing the last few years. It seems like it's getting a little bit better, like as I'm recording this today, but I know we haven't really hit usually that kind of peak of in terms of where the water temperature is in Tampa Bay, and that usually happens in August. I remember just Labor Day; it's always just so stinking hot. It feels like we've hit like the peak. What are your thoughts? Is this going to get a little worse before it gets better? Or I know you don't have a crystal ball, but like, what are your thoughts just from your background?
So red tide, it's going to be around for a little while longer. Weeks or months. Usually this, July and August, September is when we see it peak. We got it a lot earlier this year because of the discharge at Piney Point. And there's still a lot of that original nutrient source in there. The more dead fish that we have that aren't collected, that also becomes a source of food for the algae. So it is important that we're cleaning that up, and that we're, supporting the local governments that are doing that really dirty, stinky work. But that is important. The water temperature is gonna make it worse, and so we do have to be making sure that we're checking with websites like the MyFWC, the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, that are posting the results of where red tide is most severe. And, your vacation plans may change a little bit. You may decide to go fish someplace else because there's really high counts of red tide off of Pinellas County. And a lot of people are irritated by the red tide once it gets in the air. It can cause coughing and eye irritation. So don't try and be tough and, tough it out. Find some place that's safer to recreate and go fishing.
Yeah, I read that. I mean, I know they're still studying it, but there's even some longer term effects, right? Potentially with some people that it doesn't just go away, an hour after you leave. And it's like, whoa, kind of scary. So, I'm sorry, go for it.
I was just going to say, I don't know about some of the longer term impacts, but take care of yourself.
I read about it online. It's got to be true. Lindsay.
Everything online.
it found its way through Google, so it's got to be completely true.
It seems right.
All right. So where can people go learn about you? You mentioned rallies. People want to go meet you and in a COVID-free high five kind of environment. Where can they go learn about you and learn a little bit more? And do you have like a blog or anything? Are you writing about any of this stuff?
Sure. So I have lots of social media channels. I have a website, lindsaycrossfl.com. My name is spelled LINDSAYCROSSFL.com. And that's the same handle that I use for Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. So I'm out in the community. I'm attending lots of events. I don't have any scheduled in the next couple of weeks, but I'll be out talking to people, knocking on doors, and getting to know more about, besides the environment, what else people care about.
Yeah. And what do you have to say to all those Lindsays out there with EY, huh? You just want to smack them?
There's a place for all of us. I was named after Lindsay Wagner, the Bionic Woman. So that's why my name is spelled that way.
Love it.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, Lindsay, thank you so much. Everyone, definitely go check out her site there. We'll put a link to it on the show notes, and ask questions too. This is going to be an ongoing, topic, debate, whatever you want to call it. I don't think it's going away. And maybe that is a good thing that, that it's kind of come to this where we're just ticked off and we all want to work together to really see some change, not just be mad about something for a month and then just sweep it on the rug and then it disappears. So yeah, I'd love feedback. So it's saltstrong.com. You can go obviously in the fishing tips section. You could do a search for this podcast about red tide, about Lindsay Cross, and right below it, you'll see a place you can put a comment, and it comes right to me through some magical form of internet. It comes right into my inbox, and I can reply. I can forward it on to you, and you can reply, et cetera. So we'd love to hear any questions, other topics, things that we might have missed. If there's anything else about the history of Tampa, I'm really intrigued by that. So I just think you can learn so much about what people did in the past to fix something, and then, hey, where did we screw up, and how do we kind of make some tweaks? So thank you again. This has been a great podcast, and everyone, appreciate you. Make sure to subscribe to this podcast or YouTube if you're on the tuber and watching this, and we appreciate you big time. Lindsay, thank you so much for your time, and I'm sure we'll be chatting soon.
Thank you so much, Joe.
See you guys. Peace.
'Cause fishing, it's in my soul. It was passed down to me from the days of old. To find us on the water if there was a way. It's been said my papa, he wrote the book on catching big reds and 20-pound snook. I wish I knew all the things he knew today. For he's the reason why we are this way. And he put fishing